Okay, so this is this week's lecture on the Crusades, specifically the First Crusade. And this is to replace our in-class lecture that was canceled because of the weather. So one thing you need to understand with the Crusades is that they're often, they're often sort of seen to have come out of nowhere. That's not in fact true. You know, the Muslim sources you're reading in the Crusades through Arab eyes make it seem as though, so all of a sudden these barbarians appeared out of nowhere, wreaking havoc and killing people for no apparent reason. And certainly to the Muslims who were living through the Crusades and the Christian communities in the East as well, this seemed to be the case. They'd never really encountered these people before. They never really heard of them. They were familiar with the Byzantines, who were Christians, of course. They were familiar with Christian communities in the Middle East, but the Franks, which was the sort of catch-all term for the Westerners, weren't as well known, especially not outside of Byzantium. So it did seem as though they'd come out of nowhere, but they didn't, and let's explain where they came from. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been in a sort of upswing, and it reached its peak in the 11th century. However, in about the mid-11th century, it began to face threats from an outside force that was the Seljuk Turks, sometimes called Seljuk Turks. Depends if you want to spell it with an E or an A. I prefer Seljuk, but it doesn't really matter. The Seljuk Turks initially weren't concerned with Byzantium at all, and they were actually trying to conquer Baghdad and the Islamic Caliphate. In the process, they did convert to Islam, and thus the Byzantines saw them as a threat. But they weren't actually after Byzantine territory at all. They were after Syria, Palestine, and modern-day Iraq. So the Byzantine emperor, seeing them as a threat, his name was Romanus, and he gathered the biggest army Byzantium had managed to put together in quite some years, in about 20 years, the biggest army anyone had ever seen. And he marches it east, and the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, heard about this, felt threatened by it, and marched his army to meet Romanus on the field. The resulting battle was called the Battle of Manzikert, and it was a complete and utter disaster for the Byzantines. Probably about a third of the army was killed outright, the rest fled, and the emperor was captured. This led to factional infighting in Byzantium, a succession of weak emperors promoted by one political faction or another, then overthrown, and in the ensuing chaos, the Seljuks had free reign in Anatolia, which is this area here, modern-day Turkey, which was at that point the heart of the Byzantine Empire. By the time an emperor named Alexius, who was strong enough to prevent further Seljuk incursion, came to the throne, they'd lost almost all of Anatolia, only a little thin coastal strip, some territory down here, some territory up here, and the islands of Cyprus and Crete, in addition to the Balkans. Was all that remained. Alexius realized he didn't have enough men to win back Anatolia on his own, or to even counter the Turks effectively on his own. So he wrote a letter to the Pope, which ran along the lines of, "Hey, sorry we haven't talked in a while, but, we're both Christians, and I need some help in the East." And he talked about, sort of how Christian communities have fallen under the hold of Kilij Arslan, and he was referring to Anatolia, not to Jerusalem. So this letter lands on the lap of Pope Urban, who was the new pope in Rome, and he sees it as a political opportunity. So Pope Urban called this sort of council at Clermont in France, where he called upon the Christians to enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves, in part. His speech went on a lot longer than that. He basically called upon this sort of emotional appeal to the Christian knights present and the Christian lords present, and he used the appeal of the suffering of the Christian communities in the East, using some of Alexius's own words, talking about how churches had been defiled and turned into mosques, and women had been forced to marry Turkish soldiers and that sort of thing, which is all true. And the typical things actually happened on both sides of war. It wasn't that the Muslims were particularly bloodthirsty. This is just sort of the normal way of war. And indeed, Kilij Arslan largely respected the Christian population in Anatolia. But nonetheless, this was Alexius's language in this letter. So Urban used that language, but he made it sound to the gathered speakers as though it was actually Jerusalem that was under threat, and the holy places in Jerusalem, not in Turkey or in Anatolia. So he just sort of blanketly referred to the Christian communities in the East, our Christian brothers in the East. They're living under the yoke of a foreign conqueror and subject to a foreign religion. So the response was emotional, as it was meant to be, and a lot of knights at that point sort of threw down their cloaks, pulled up their swords, and swore that they would march to Jerusalem to liberate it, even though it hadn't been Christian in 400 years from the hands of the Muslims. They cried, "Das Volt," God wills it, it's God's will. And within about a year, they were on the march. You might ask why it took a year, and that largely had to do with how armies were gathered in those days. Generally there wasn't a standing army, or if it was quite small. Your army was all the males you could put your hands on and put a sword in their hands. So it took about a year to create and equip these armies, which is why it took about a year from 1095, when the speech was given, until 1096, when the First Crusade started to move to the east. So what was Urban trying to do? He was essentially trying to create a superpower, and the superpower was going to be him as the Pope, as head of the Christian states in the West. This makes sense if you realize that the Christian states in the West were very fractured, a lot of infighting. There wasn't a lot of centralized governments. Those that were quite weak, and the Pope saw this as an opportunity to make himself kind of the central figure, if not the central ruler in Europe. So largely, Urban was trying to launch these crusades for political motivation. And another handy sidestep to this was that the Christian kingdoms in the West, those kingdoms that had overthrown the Roman Empire and arisen in its stead, and then fought amongst the territory amongst themselves, were quite violent, and a lot of the sort of ideal of masculinity was attached to violence. So these quite violent, warlike kingdoms, petty kingdoms, petty states ruled by violent, warlike men, would spend a lot of time killing each other. And another part of Urban's approach was, look, if I can get them to stop killing each other and start killing other people, that's a form of control. I talked about the schism a couple weeks ago. It should have been in week 6. And the schism was the break between the Eastern and Western Church after Byzantium began to come under trouble. Another aspect of Europe was that most of the wealth of Europe was in the hands of these Italian city-states. These tended to be the wealthiest parts of Europe, the wealthiest conditions in Europe existed here, and Urban was also keen to sort of get that wealth under his control. And the Crusaders and the city-states themselves saw supporting the Crusaders, supplying them with navies, as a chance to expand their own influence. Nonetheless, despite the fact that Urban sort of hijacked the crusade and turned it toward Jerusalem, Byzantium was under legitimate threat. And for centuries, Byzantium had kind of acted as the buffer between the Middle East and the Catholic West. And it's a buffer in the political sense, in the social sense, in the cultural sense, in the religious sense, any sense you can imagine. Byzantium acted as kind of a buffer. And Christian pilgrimage to the east was actually fairly common. Usually they would go along to Constantinople, pass through imperial territory that was safe and secure and monitored, and then cross through a traditional pilgrim road to Jerusalem before returning home, sometimes by sea and sometimes by land, or sometimes they would stay on or take up service with the emperor. In the sort of chaotic condition that followed the Seljuk conquest of Persia, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and Anatolia, a lot of these pilgrims were under danger. You know, traveling was no longer safe. You weren't going through structured states that had infrastructure in place to aid pilgrims. You were traveling in contested areas that were being fought over that had no real ruler. And this made visiting the holy sites in Jerusalem dangerous, and made the visitors subject to harassment. So these stories about how, you know, it was becoming more difficult to visit the East would have been trickling home as well, in addition to Alexius's plea to Urban for help. The Crusades were a new concept of war for the Christians in the West. Previously, they had largely adhered to the just war theory. The war was waged under the auspices of the state. The state would be responsible for deciding if war was just or not, and vindication of justice would usually be defense of life and property. There was restrained conduct with regard to the enemy. You didn't kill prisoners and non-combatants. You didn't kill women or children. But that was, you know, written during the time of the Roman Empire, during a relatively peaceful time. And this is much later. This is a more dangerous, more violent time. So the concept of war, at the Crusaders' point of view, was at the behest of the Pope, but under the operation and control of kings. So there is no real state, at least not a centralized, organized state like there had been in the Roman time, which largely led to, you know, the I'll be violent, but the next king might not be, but the next king might be violent type of affair you read in the Crusades through Arab eyes. This was also no longer defense of life and property, but defense of the faith, which is very different. You know, you're not fighting for your own protection or for the protection of your community. You're fighting for the faith at large, and no restraint with regards to dealing with the infidel. You know, they would say to kill an infidel is not murder, whereas to kill your fellow Christian is. So if you're a young testosterone-driven male in the West, and you've been trained to fight, and all you know is fighting, and they're telling you can't kill other Christians anymore, but you can kill infidels. That's part of where it came from. Okay. So Pope Urban, after giving this speech in Clermont, traveled to various cities for about 9 months, preaching the crusade and offering inducements to include plenary indulgence, remitting all punishments due to sin for those who died on the crusade. A plenary indulgence is basically, you know, the sins you're gonna commit, we're forgiving ahead of time. So going abroad, stealing things, killing people, it's cool as long as you go on this crusade, which was, again, part of the motivation. Also, serfs were allowed to leave the land to which they were bound. So serfdom, which was a part of medieval Europe, the serfs were effectively slaves, although not quite the same. They had freedom to marry who they liked and that sort of thing. Their children were taken from them. They couldn't be sold. But they were bound to the land and bound to the Lord. They could leave the land to go fight. And citizens were exempted from taxes, which was especially important for dukes and earls and that sort of thing. Debtors were given a moratorium on interest. Interest was suspended while they were on crusade and forgiven if they died. Prisoners were freed and death sentences were commuted as long as they agreed to spend the rest of their life serving in Palestine. As opposed to being executed, this probably seemed like a pretty good deal. Anyway, I'm going to stop here, upload this video, and there'll be a second part coming.